The first thing Marcus Webb did after the seatbelt sign chimed off was check that the small cooler bag was still zipped shut beneath the seat in front of him, because some habits outlive the reasons that built them. Flight 1847, a Boeing 737 operated under his own company's livery, sat on the tarmac at Denver International for 11 minutes before pushback, and Marcus spent every one of those minutes in 3A doing what he always did when he flew commercial instead of the jet the board insisted he was entitled to. He watched. He was 58, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had once carried packs through worse terrain than an aisle, with a face weathered more by sun than by age and a close-cropped beard going the color of ash at the jaw. He wore a gray quarter-zip with no logo, jeans, and boots that had seen actual dirt. Nothing about him said chief executive. Everything about him said pay attention to the man in 3A, if you knew how to look. The way he scanned the cabin door each time it opened, the way his eyes flicked to the overhead bins like he was counting inventory, the way his hand rested for one unconscious second over his sternum, where a smaller version of his company's wings pin sat clipped inside his jacket, not pinned outside where anyone could see it. He was flying to Reagan National for a hearing in front of a Senate subcommittee on airline accessibility. His own initiative, the one his PR team had begged him not to attend in person, the one he'd insisted on anyway because some testimony needed a human face attached to it. Tomorrow morning he would describe, under oath, what it felt like as a 19-year-old Army private to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes mid-deployment and discharged not for incompetence but for a body that no longer cooperated with the timetable the military required of it. He would describe building an airline 26 years later, with policies built around people like the boy he had been. Tonight, he was just a passenger with an insulin pen, 2 backup vials, and a glucose meter zipped into a soft-sided cooler bag that he had personally redesigned the underseat storage dimensions to accommodate for fleet-wide retrofits ago. The cabin filled the way cabins do, in waves of noise and elbow negotiation. 2 rows back, a woman named Priya Patel settled into 5C with a toddler asleep against her chest, and a paperback she would not open until Atlanta. Across the aisle, a retired contractor named Earl Voss, broad-bellied and sunburned from a fishing trip, struck up a one-sided conversation with the flight attendant working the front galley, a woman in her 40s with silver threading through dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like discipline made visible. Her name tag read Denise. She had the particular calm of someone who had worked the aisles long enough to recognize trouble by its posture before it ever opened its mouth. The recycled air carried coffee and someone's drugstore perfume and the faint metallic tang that all commercial cabins share, the smell of climate control fighting altitude. Light came low and gold through the oval windows, the kind of late-afternoon Denver light that turns runway concrete the color of a healing bruise. The safety video played. The captain's voice came over the intercom, unhurried, almost paternal. Folks, we're third for departure. Should have you wheels up in about 10. And Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, doing math he had done 10,000 times before. Hours until landing, hours since his last dose. The small, unglamorous arithmetic that kept him alive and that no boardroom ever asked about. He had just settled into the particular stillness of a man who trusted his own preparation when the gate agent reappeared at the cabin door, flushed, trailing a passenger whose voice arrived a full 2 seconds before her body did sharp, carrying, already mid-complaint about something nobody else in the cabin had yet been permitted to understand. Her name was Catherine Voss Lindqvist, though by the time this flight was over, half the cabin would only ever remember her as Karen, and the other half would remember her as something considerably worse. She came through the door in a cream wrap coat that had never once touched a coat check counter, sunglasses pushed up into a blowout too rigid for recycled cabin air, and a quilted leather tote slung over one shoulder with a logo turned deliberately outward. Like a passport she expected the entire aircraft to stamp on sight. She moved up the aisle the way certain people move through hotel lobbies, chin elevated, gaze sweeping past faces rather than across them, already irritated by a flight that had not yet wronged her in any specific way. "This can't be right," she said to no one and everyone, stopping dead at row 14 and staring at her boarding pass like it had personally insulted her. "I booked this through the app. I always get an upgrade through the app." A flight attendant named Carla, 26, 3 years into the job and still wearing her patients like new shoes, offered to check the manifest. Catherine did not wait for the offer to finish. Just don't. I'll stand here. Somebody go get someone who actually has authority." Beat 2 arrived 4 minutes later, with the gate agent reboarded and breathless, trying to explain in the combat firm register airline employees are trained into that the rolling suitcase Catherine had wedged sideways into row 9's overhead bin, crushing someone else's garment bag in the process, would need to be checked, free of charge, gateside, per standard policy. "I am not checking this bag," Catherine said, loud enough that 3 rows of passengers lowered their phones. "Do you understand who I'm friends with? I had dinner with your VP of Customer Experience 11 months ago at a fundraiser in Aspen. I will be calling Janet the second we land. Janet knows my name." She said the name Janet the way other people invoke scripture. It was somewhere in that performance. Mid-sentence, mid-gesture, the tote bag swinging wide as she pointed back toward the cockpit like Janet might materialize from it, that her gaze finally snagged on Marcus Webb. Not because of anything he'd done. He was, in fact, the only person in the immediate vicinity not looking at her. He sat with his eyes on the small cooler bag he just pulled partway from beneath the seat ahead of him, checking the zipper, the unremarkable private ritual of a man managing a chronic condition in public the way he trained himself to for 40 years. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. To Catherine, scanning the cabin for an audience that wasn't sufficiently afraid of her, his indifference read as insult. "You," she said, stopping beside row 3, sunglasses now fully off, eyes locking onto him with the brightness of someone who has found, at last, somewhere to put all this. "What is that?" Marcus looked up. "Excuse me? That bag, under your seat. It's blocking the aisle space I need for my carry-on." It was not blocking anything. It was 11 inches wide and tucked entirely beneath the seat ahead, exactly where federal regulation and his own company's policy required medical equipment to be stowed. He said as much evenly without raising his voice. "It's a medical kit. It needs to stay with me." Catherine's mouth did something complicated, a flicker of a smile that had nothing to do with humor. "Of course it does," she said, in the tone of someone humoring a child's excuse. "Everyone's got a medical kit these days." The trigger, when it came, was almost absurdly small. Denise had finally coaxed Catherine into seat 14F, 3 rows from where her bag dispute had begun, but not before Catherine detoured, ostensibly to retrieve a phone charger from her tote. Back up the aisle to row 3, where she crouched, uninvited, and reached beneath the seat in front of Marcus. "I just want to see what's so important it needs its own real estate," she said, and her fingers closed around the strap of the cooler bag before Marcus's hand could close around her wrist, because he was reaching for it too late, a half-second behind a woman who had decided, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, that this stranger's quiet refusal to be afraid of her was a debt that needed collecting. She unzipped it in the aisle. The insulin pen, 2 backup glass vials wrapped in their cold-pack sleeve, the glucose meter, all of it spilled into her palm and then, in the same motion, into her open tote, scooped with the indiscriminate carelessness of someone clearing a table. "If it's so medical," she said, straightening, voice pitched for the whole cabin now, "you won't mind if I hold on to it until you can prove that to someone with actual authority. For all I know, it's drugs." The sound was small and should have been nothing. Glass shifting against leather, a zipper dragging shut, but Marcus felt it land somewhere below his ribs with the force of a door slamming. He came halfway out of his seat, one hand braced on the armrest, and for one unsteady second the cabin tilted in a way that had nothing to do with the plane's angle on the tarmac. He knew, with the precise, unglamorous clarity of a man who'd run this calculation his whole adult life, exactly how many hours it had been since his last dose and exactly how few hours of margin he had left before his body stopped negotiating and started failing. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for her. His hands, when he spoke, were flat and open at his sides, the posture of a man holding himself together by main force. "That is insulin," he said. "I am a type 1 diabetic. I need that bag back in my possession right now." "Sure you do," Catherine said, and laughed. A short, performative bark with no warmth in it. Everybody's got a sob story to get out of being told no. Priya Patel, 2 rows back, had gone very still, one arm tightening instinctively around her sleeping toddler. Earl Voss had pulled an AirPod from his ear and was staring with the slack-jawed disbelief of a man watching a car accident assemble itself in slow motion. A young woman in row 6, headphones around her neck, had her hands pressed flat against her thighs, visibly shaking. Not from fear of Catherine, but from the particular helpless fury of watching someone be hurt and not knowing yet whether it was her place to move. "Ma'am." Denise arrived from 3 rows back at something just short of a run, her voice dropping into the register flight attendants reserved for the moments their training was built for. "Ma'am, I need you to return that bag immediately. That is a federal regulation violation, withholding a passenger's prescribed medical." "Oh, don't you start," Catherine said, rounding on her, and here was the moment, the one the cabin would replay in whispered retellings for the rest of the flight and long after it landed. "I have seen people fake this exact thing to skip lines, to get free upgrades, to get attention. I am not handing emergency drugs to some man who can't even be bothered to dress like he belongs up here. You people just hand out sympathy to anyone with a hard luck story and a thrift store jacket." The seatbelt sign chimed on, sharp and sudden, though the aircraft hadn't moved. Denise had pressed the call button with her free hand without anyone seeing her do it, and now her voice carried clean through the cabin. No longer the gentle register of customer service, but something with an edge underneath it, honed by a decade of exactly this. "Ma'am, give me the bag. Now." Marcus's vision had gone soft at the edges, the particular cottony unreality that came before things got dangerous, and he understood with total clinical calm that he had perhaps 20 minutes before this stopped being an argument about decency and became an emergency a med kit and an EpiPen wouldn't fix. He kept his hands open. He kept his voice level. He thought, distantly, of a hillside in 2002 and a medic who hadn't gotten there in time, and he made himself breathe through it instead of toward it. It was the man in 16B, silent until now, dressed in the deliberately unremarkable way of someone trained to be forgettable, who rose first, unhurried, and began to move up the aisle with his eyes fixed not on Catherine but on Marcus, the particular focus of a man assessing a medical timeline. The badge appeared not from Marcus's hand but from the air marshal's, held low and open at his hip as he reached row 3. A quiet flash of gold and blue, federal seal catching the cabin light. "Sir," he said to Marcus. "How long since your last dose?" Marcus told him, and the marshal's jaw tightened a fraction before he turned, fully, toward Catherine, his voice dropping into something with no theater left in it at all. "Ma'am, you are in possession of stolen prescription medication belonging to a passenger experiencing a documented medical emergency. Open the bag. Now." Catherine's mouth opened on another protest and then simply stopped working. The cabin had gone unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Denise had already produced the aircraft's emergency medical kit, kneeling beside Marcus with a glucose tablet in one hand, and it was in the middle of that small mercy. Denise pressing the tablet into his palm, the marshal extracting the insulin pen and vials from Catherine's tote with 2 gloved fingers like evidence at a scene, that the second reveal happened, smaller, but the one that would silence the whole cabin completely. "Mr. Webb," the marshal said, not as a question, returning the cooler bag into Marcus's hands with something close to reverence. "Sir, I flew your airline's first accessibility training cohort. I know exactly who you are." The words traveled down the cabin in a current you could almost see. Priya's sharp inhale, Earl's AirPod forgotten in his fist, the young woman in row 6 going still in a different way now. Catherine's face did 5 things in 5 seconds. Confusion first, a blink that didn't understand the sentence. Then the processing, her eyes flicking from the marshal's badge to Marcus's plain gray quarter zip like the 2 facts refused to occupy the same body. Then the realization, color draining from her face in a way no foundation could disguise. Then the attempt to recover. "I didn't. There's no way to know that, he doesn't even." And then, last, the moment she understood, watching 26 rows of strangers turn to look at her in total silence, that it was already too late to matter what she said next. "Folks," the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but unmistakably altered. "We're going to hold at the gate a few extra minutes while we sort out a situation on board. Appreciate your patience." 2 airport police officers met the marshal at the forward door within 90 seconds. The kind of speed that told the whole cabin radio calls had gone out the moment the marshal pressed his own emergency contact. A Denver PD sergeant named Alvarez who took one look at the scene, the badge, the insulin vials laid out on the galley counter, and didn't ask a single unnecessary question. Marcus, color returning to his face as the glucose worked through his system, and Denise monitored his pulse with the quiet competence of someone who trained for exactly this and never expected to use it on her own CEO. Finally stood. He did not raise his voice. He addressed Catherine directly, and the cabin leaned in to hear a man who had every right to fury choose something quieter instead. I built this airline's medical accommodation policy after watching my own discharge paperwork get lost 3 times, because somebody decided my diagnosis was inconvenient to believe, he said. You didn't take a bag from me today. You took 90 seconds I didn't have to spare, and you did it because you assumed nobody in a thrift store jacket could possibly be someone whose word mattered. I hope you remember exactly how that assumption felt, because it's about to cost you considerably more than an upgrade. The applause started with Priya, who began clapping with her free hand while her daughter slept on, undisturbed, against her chest, and it spread the way fire spreads through dry grass. Earl Voss banging his palms together with the enthusiasm of a man at a ballgame. The young woman in row 6 finally letting her shaking hands do something other than tremble. Denise straightened from her crouch beside Marcus and simply nodded once, the closest thing to a victory lap her professionalism would allow. A small boy in row 8 tugged his mother's sleeve and asked, in the carrying whisper children use when they think they're being quiet, "Is that man a superhero?" His mother, eyes wet, said, "Something like that, baby." The officers walked Catherine down the aisle in handcuffs that caught the cabin light the same way the badge had. Her cream coat dragging slightly against seatbacks she no longer had the composure to avoid. She passed row after row of faces that did not look away, and nobody spoke to her, which was somehow worse than if they had. At the door, she turned back once. Whether to apologize or to argue, the cabin would never know, because the door closed on whatever she meant to say, and the silence she left behind felt, for several long seconds, like the whole aircraft exhaling at once. The plane pushed back 19 minutes later than scheduled, climbing into a sky gone the deep bruised purple of early evening, and somewhere over Kansas, Marcus Webb finally let himself sleep, the cooler bag zipped and resting against his hip where it belonged. Denise brought him water without being asked and didn't make him thank her for it. Federal charges followed within the week: theft of a controlled prescription substance, reckless endangerment, interference with crew, a criminal complaint number that would outlive every headline about it. The airline issued a 2-line statement confirming a lifetime travel ban and a full review of onboard medical bag protections, though everyone who'd been on Flight 1847 already understood the real policy had been written, quietly years before, by a man who never once needed the cabin to know his name to do the right thing in it. Somewhere over the Appalachians, Marcus opened his eyes just long enough to watch the last orange light bleed off the wing, and closed them again, breathing easy, exactly the way he was supposed to.